maximizing uptime with FireCluster. And I'm Johan Blumhardt, sales engineer for the Northwest. As many of you know, I've spent a number of years in education. Had the pleasure of working with WatchGuard for a number of years, and this is just one of those topics that comes up again and again, where people either want 99.999% uptime, or as they upgrade, just like you would with for instance, an iPhone or an Android device, where you upgrade and that asks you to reboot because you want to leverage some of those new features. The same thing with a high availability cluster. So a cluster will allow you to essentially have two devices. One of those devices is going to be the master, and we'll talk about that more in depth during this session about the differences between active-active and active-passive. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's throw up the agenda. If you've joined me before, you know that I like to have a little bit of slideshows, or a few slides, go over the basics, and then really dive in and show you guys how to set that up and what that looks like in a real live environment. So as we look at today's agenda, we have a FireCluster overview. Again, we're running two firewalls, either in a virtual or a hardware capacity, so that if one goes down, which would be an active passive, the other one will take over the roles of that, the master. So we're going to cover a FireCluster overview. We're going to discuss what is a cluster member, different types of FireClusters. We're going to look at what causes a FireCluster failover, and then a hands-on setup of that FireCluster. Now, an important note as we look at Dimension command coming out and some of the new web UI features that we have, you can use a web UI to manage a FireCluster. However, today you need to perform the initial setup and ongoing FireCluster configuration through the WatchGuard System Manager, which we'll go ahead and dive in and show you as well a little bit later on. So let's go ahead and look at a FireCluster overview. So again, as I mentioned, a FireCluster is a pair of XCM devices, either hardware or a virtual, either Hyper-V or a VMware devices, configured to provide network redundancy and improved scalability. So as we look at this sample topology, we have the internet. Now, in this device, let's say you're in a hospital or something where you need to really have that maximized uptime, or for instance, a bank where downtime might represent tens of thousands of dollars an hour of lost revenue. So in this case, we have two firewalls. We have a cluster interface. The textbook wants to have also a backup cluster interface. For today's demonstration on a virtual, we're just going to have one of those cluster interfaces. And then we're going to build our networks off of that. So just like the picture shows, we have a trusted network. And then we also have an optional network as well. So while these are shown as different switches, obviously you can use VLANs for those switches, but it just needs to keep that traffic separate on there. So what is a cluster member? And really, as you break it down, a cluster member is any device that is part of a FireCluster. It can generally, well, most times it takes one of the following two roles in a cluster. So we take a cluster master, and that's a device that updates and maintains all the connection and session information for the cluster and synchronizes the information with the backup master. And then we have the backup master, and that's the device that monitors the cluster master and automatically takes over the role of a cluster master in the event of a failover. Now, these are in an active passive configuration here, and that's what we'll show you a little bit later on, is the active passive in terms of the type of cluster. Now, as we look at all the different types of clusters, we have an active-active cluster, and in that situation, both cluster members share the load of traffic. If either member fails, the other member takes on the entire load for the cluster. Now, generally, as we're looking at speccing out, people often ask me to spec out what their network needs are. They might be looking at active-active, and the question I would ask you is, okay, well, what happens then in the event that one of the firewalls is rebooted? The second firewall would have to actually take over everything. So if you look at a product matrix and you look at what a firewall would be necessary to run the entire network, a lot of times it's actually quite a bit more advantageous to go with active passive. It's cheaper, and that way if one of your devices fails, the other one takes over, but you have sized your firewall appropriate for the network to begin with. And then in terms of a licensing cost, let's say you have APT blocker in your security subscriptions, you don't, in active passive, you don't need to have those same licenses on the passive device. So those will, licenses will simply roll over to the passive device, which then in the event of a failover, the passive would become the master, and then those licenses would just transfer. So as we look at active passive cluster, it's also known as an active standby, depending on what terminology you're used to or what other vendors you've worked with. And then in that case, only the cluster master handles the network traffic. So again, as you look at sizing a box for your network, in this model, active passive, you would simply say, you know what, maybe I'm fitting in an M400 to run all of my device traffic, and then we're going to go ahead and just get you a second M400 in the event that you need to reboot or set up your secondary device. Now, as we look at some of the causes of a fire cluster failover, so again, we see here a number of reasons why that fire cluster would fail over. So one of the cases is losing a heartbeat from the cluster master. So again, that's just on a cluster interface. We're monitoring that device, and all of a sudden, if we don't see 3 heartbeats coming back, we're going to go ahead and trigger that failover, and that's all automatic. Now, it's just always fascinating as I get out and I talk with different individuals about some of their network topologies and setup, and some cases we have customers that have a secondary device sitting on a shelf somewhere, and then they do a manual switch over. Obviously, with an active passive and an active environment, as we are going over today, that's just going to be all automatic for you. You're not going to need to run into the office at 3 o'clock in the morning to switch that over. So that's all automatic on that heartbeat or that cluster interface. So here we see a cluster master sends a heartbeat packet through the primary and backup cluster interfaces once per second. Now, in some cases where interface counts, you might be out of real estate with your interfaces. You might only have the primary, but obviously, as we talk about best case scenario, it also includes having a backup cluster interface as well. You can increase the lost heartbeat threshold that triggers a failover, as we see here. So you can go ahead and increase that, or you can set that manually if 3 isn't sufficient for your needs. So as we look at a software or hardware malfunction, so if a software or hardware error is detected on a cluster memory, that can also trigger a failover of that device. Now, as we talk about a software malfunction, that could also be, let's say you're upgrading to take advantage of the new FQDN and some of our later code. You want to upgrade your firewall. There's actually a process that the WatchGuard system manager handles all that process for you. So essentially, it's going to upgrade one device, reboot that, switch over all of your traffic to the secondary device, and then go ahead and upgrade that one as well. So in the other event that the monitored interface link is down, that's going to also trigger a fire cluster failover. You can also say, you know what, let's go ahead and tell the fire cluster to fail over, and that's through the WatchGuard system manager, and we can enforce that. So that's the last way that a fire cluster can actually fail over. Now, as we look at setting the IP addresses of the fire cluster, it really helps to sit down and kind of make this chart that I have here. And this is actually the example that we're going to use in this tutorial here. Is that we're going to look at setting the member 1 IP address to actually a 169 Now, each pair of cluster interfaces must be assigned an IP address on the same subnet. Also, it's recommended that you allocate a dedicated private subnet to each interface or use link local IP addresses for the cluster interfaces. Now, just keep in mind that if you're currently running a 169, for instance, a link local IP address in your network, such as a 169.254, you could actually run into some issues by setting that up into your network, as we're seeing here. So as we look at a primary cluster interface, again, set up some sort of table in Excel and write out these address schemes. So we see our primary cluster interface off of interface 3, and then that also becomes the third octet of my member 1 IP address. Now, member 2 IP address also shares that, and we can see that it increments up here. For today's demonstration, we're not going to have the backup cluster interface. So again, these two IP addresses are what handles all the back-end communications. Now, we also have that management interface, and that's if I want to connect to the FireBytes individually. So I can simply go to the web UI or connect through WSM to this individual box or the member 2 IP address. But most of the time, keep in mind, I'm going to use that just if it's a 10.0.1.1 for that trusted interface, I'm just going to use that to connect to the web UI, make changes to the policies, maybe make enable APT blocker, or make changes to DLP signatures, and then we're going to simply that will mirror out to any member that's a part of that Fire cluster. So hopefully that's clear, and we'll come back to this as we look at how the Fire cluster is actually set up in the live environment. So let me go ahead and switch over. Now, as many of you are aware, I love the virtual environment. And just to go over what I have here, so this is actually a Hyper-V, or excuse me, a VMware environment running off of Intel NUC here. I have my Dimension Command set up. And again, if you haven't checked out Dimension Command, feel free to reach out to your local SE. We have a great promo SKU going on for that. We'll cover that, as Wendy mentioned, next session. I have 2 virtual firewalls that are set up in a virtual cluster right now, so I'm going to demonstrate that cluster and then go ahead and break that so that you can see that failover, as well as deconfigure that cluster, and then we'll start over and show you that whole process as well. So in this case, I'm in FireBytes System Manager in the cluster view. I've simply gone in. I can see my cluster members. So I have my member 2, which is Seattle XMD-02. It's actually the master. And again, this is set up as an active passive or active standby cluster. So in the event that it was active-active, both of these firewalls would be transmitting traffic. So right now, Seattle 02 is my master firewall, and 01 is my backup master. I'm also pinging a well-known IP address, Google DNS server here. We can see that ping going on. And really what I'm going to do right now is just go ahead and flip the switch on my primary firewall, and we'll see that process. Let me go ahead and stagger these windows so you can see that process as it unfolds here. So I'm going to go ahead on my 02 firewall. Let's just imagine that maybe the power cut out and 01's on a backup generator. I'm going to go ahead and just cut out the power of 02. We're going to see a loss of pings on there. And immediately, I've seen an average about 2 ping timeouts. We're going to see that traffic come back as my roles will actually switch over. So it'll just be a second that we take that refresh rate, and we'll see that the process take over from there. So again, we just cut the power to my 02 firewall. 01 has taken over, and now we see that 01 or member 1 has become the master, and member 2 has become inactive. Now, let's go ahead and turn on the power to that. We can see that firewall coming on right here. Again, in a VMware environment, these firewalls, the startup, just phenomenal. Just takes a second or two, and they're up and running away. So we have, again, 01. I'm going to go ahead on this one and say, you know what, let's just envision that we have lost as soon as I see that 02 has come up here. I'm going to go ahead and say, you know what, let's go ahead and cut the network. Let's say it's the WAN connection on that one. And we should see that process take over as well. So let's say you're on a primary circuit and your internet connection goes down in there. We see that role simply switch over right there and goes out your, in this case it's going out 02 firewall. So now I'm going to go ahead and get into Policy Manager, and I'm going to break that, and essentially we're going to reverse engineer, start from scratch, and show you how we can start that process. So let me just clean up things a little bit here. So I'm going to go ahead and load up Policy Manager. Under Fire Cluster, again, I'm just going to break this one. I'm going to say don't enable Fire Cluster, which in a sense is going to disable it. I'm going to save that to the box. It's just going to reboot those because we're removing the we're removing that configuration from the Fire Cluster. It's going to reboot. Now, as we're doing this, again, the key really is to start out with that diagram as I showed you. I'm going to actually bring that up on the secondary screen here, zoom in on a little bit so that you can see where these IP addresses are going to be configured at. Now, as my firewalls are coming back, there are a number of different ways to do that. A couple of different ways to set up your Fire Cluster. So one is that you can actually put your secondary device in safe mode and discover that. For the virtual firewalls, what I'm actually going to do is configure, I'm going to come into my firewalls and actually just open up the config on one of them. So let's just go ahead and close out of my windows here. I'm going to go ahead and just power down my secondary firewall on there. So that firewall's shut down, as we can see here. Now the key is really to grab your feature keys and have both of them readily available on the computer that you're going to configure the Fire Cluster through. So I'm going to, at this point, start up Policy Manager, get into my primary device here, connect the device. So now I have my primary device here. I don't believe that was fully rebooted, but we shall see. I'm going to just give that another reboot here. And if many of, if you haven't given a webinar, the number one rule to webinars is that you don't do a live demo because there will always be something wrong that happens. So in this case, I'm showing you that there are some things that sometimes you just have to adjust to. That's why it's nice to start off with a working configuration and then kind of reverse engineer it from there. So I'm rebooting my firewall here. Something wasn't quite reset on there. So as my secondary or my primary firewall comes up here, let's go ahead and find out what's going on with my VMware and infrastructure. There we go. We've got the firewall that came up. And on this, I'm just going to find out what my IP address is, make sure that's the right IP address. Okay, so we should be good to go on there. And then the default username and password for that is status and then read only. So go ahead, I believe at this point that it goes ahead and resets it to factory defaults. Let's just check if that is the case. Factory default, we can see there by the policy set. I'm just going to go ahead and under Fire Cluster, go ahead and start that process as well. And actually, since it did default that, I'm going to go ahead and use a config that I had before that has all of my interfaces set up. So in this case, we have all of my external configuration. And that's a great point to bring up as well, as we just saw by the other screen, is that you can't configure a Fire cluster with a DHCP for external IP addresses. So you might just need to bump up that plan with your ISP to get some statically assigned IP addresses. In this case, I'm running as a 1.1.1.10 IP address. And then we see here my trusted interface. We see my optional interface. And then on this case, I'm running a small virtual small firewall or small office firewall that only gives me 4 interfaces. So in this case, interface 3 is going to become my cluster interface that monitors traffic between the firewalls. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's go ahead and set that up as a Fire cluster. And again, just to recap, I am configuring my firewall 01. 02 is actually shut off at the moment. I'm going to go ahead and configure that as an active passive cluster. Now, if you do have more than one firewall on the network, or more than one Fire cluster on the network, you're going to need to change that IP address or change the cluster ID for that. Going to just choose the optional or the default cluster ID of 1. I'm going to set my primary cluster interface again as 3 port or interface 3. I'm not going to set up a backup interface for that. And then I'm going to say my management IP address is going to reside on my trusted interface, which is that 10.0.1.1 IP address. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and import my firewall feature keys for 01, and then I'm just going to repeat the process again for 02. And I just saved those. Excuse me, let me go ahead and show that to you in person. I just saved it to a text file here. So as I choose select, it's just pasting that feature key right in here. And the great thing is, we'll cover that next week. If you have Dimension Command, it just adds a new line item on that feature key that extends the functionality of that firewall. Very cool things in Dimension Command, so make sure you check out that session as well. Just choose OK. I'm going to go ahead and label that. I'm going to just stick with the default of member 1. I see there my serial number as well. Now for my cluster IP addresses, again, as we go over that, it's going to it's crucial to outline this and just document this beforehand and keep that as well. So in this case, member 1 IP address is 169.254.3.1 because it's a 01 on my firewall. Now as I look at the secondary firewall, I'm going to just choose it right there. And then my management IP address, again, as we look at that interface 1, and then my IP address is 1.101. And again, we just want that, I'm just defaulting to a /24 for that as well. Going to go ahead and choose next. It says, do you want to add another device to that Fire cluster? In this case, I want to go ahead and say yes. I'm going to go ahead and choose the feature key for my secondary firewall now. So 02, again, it just copies that in there. I'm going to go ahead and choose next. It chooses my member name on there. And now in this case, as I mentioned, I'm going to use the IP address, again, primary cluster. I'm leaving out the backup cluster interface because in my small edition, my virtual firewall, I ran out of interfaces on there. So I'm going to just choose it as a 3.2 as I have shown here. And then my management IP address is going to be .102, as you can see below. I'm going to go ahead and click next. It tells me that it's finished, and it gets me into this firewall, or excuse me, fire cluster configuration mode. So if I wanted to change IP addresses, I could do that down the road. I can look at my members that are in that fire cluster. I can go ahead and edit them. Maybe I need to change a feature key, or let's say in this case, I just brought on, just purchased AP key blocker, and go ahead and just import that feature key on those as well from there. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Again, right now we're just saving to the primary firewall, just 0.1. And now in the event that you had a hardware firewall, at this point you could go ahead and boot up your secondary device in a standby mode. But in my case, I'm with the virtual firewalls, I'm actually going to shut down 0.1, bring up 0.2, and as that firewall comes up 0.2, excuse me, let's go ahead and open up the console for that. Yeah, I just love the VMware environment. Allows me to create situations like this on the fly, and really just phenomenal environment to be working in as an engineer. So from here, I want to just make sure I have the right IP address, make sure that my firewall is alive. We see here it's alive. And now I just take my secondary config, save to Firebox. If I had a different IP address, I could put it in there. I'm going to go ahead and just type in a password, and it's going to upgrade or upload that configuration. So now that identical policy resides on both firewalls, I can go ahead and bring up my primary device or primary firewall, power on, and as that firewall is coming on, we should see that that traffic. Now we can go into WatchGuard System Manager and see that cluster become active. So in this case, we see, actually, this is a great point right here. It was, it showed me Seattle XMV01 login. And as it changed to the cluster, now it changes to that new name, member2 login. And let's go ahead and we have the firewall pings back there. Disconnect all. I'm going to go ahead and say, let's connect to the device. And then I'm going to go into Firebox System Manager. Right here we see member 1, backup master, member 2 is the master. We can see those management IP addresses that we have here. And again, a critical component that I apologize I haven't mentioned before, but your firewalls do need to be identical in terms of hardware as well as the firmware version for those. Now, as we look at this, we can also look at our management tools for the cluster. So we have a discover member, we have failover master, reboot member, shutdown member, or connect member. So this is our cluster management area here. So in the event that we had a hardware firewalls, we could just boot your secondary firewall in safe mode and say discover member, and that's going to choose that process there. Now, the other thing I did want to mention real quick here is how to perform an update of your firewall version. So we can just go, I'm going to go ahead and choose my firewall cluster, go into Policy Manager. And again, in this case, many of you are familiar with how to download that the firmware version for your firewall and just extract that for the System Manager. Now, in this case, we just want to go to firewall, or excuse me, file, upgrade. I'm going to type in my password. And again, this is the process for how to upgrade a cluster with a new firmware version. So I'm going to choose my path to upgrade image. It just defaults to the latest upgrade image for you. Choose next. It says it will be upgraded to the new image. It will restart when the upgrade is complete. Go ahead and click OK. And now at this point, it sees that it's a Fire cluster and it says, which Fire cluster members do you want to upgrade? So I'm going to choose both of them. And now in this case, it's upgrading my, actually my backup master. So it's 01, which was not the primary. It's upgrading that one first. And let's see that boot process. So it's upgrading that one first. And as soon as that one comes back and is operational, then it's going to go ahead and switch over my traffic to that secondary device. I'm going to just choose a ping here. Whoops. I'm going to go ahead and just ping Google. We'll watch that process. And as that flips the roles of that, as soon as my 01 is complete, then it's going to reboot the process of, or reboot and install, upgrade the firmware of the member 2 format. And that is essentially how we're able to just maintain that 99.999% uptime for you. So at this case, 01 is complete on that boot process. And as soon as it checks in, it says, okay, it's done. It's going to go ahead and upload the OS file to member 2 and switch over the member services. So as we look here, we can see member 2 is the master, and then it's going to flip that services over. We see my Google DNS ping switch over, and now it's completing that upgrade process.